Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rohini Bhattacharya. I am going to be presenting this webinar today with my colleague Hannah Eldridge, who's the EPA Delivery Manager. I also have with me my colleagues from the marketing division, Sapna Kimani, who would be the host and controlling the webinar. Today, we would be going through the workflow process for the endpoint assessment delivery. We will then look at some of the timelines that we all need to follow for ensuring we have timely endpoint assessments for your apprentices. We'll also go through the onboarding process that we would be rolling out shortly next month for SmartEPA, our EPA delivery system that we are partnering with Smart Apprentices on. We will also go through some of the actions that you can complete on SmartEPA once we go live with the system in October. Finally, we will go through the Golive process. It is going to be a staged process. It has been a huge sort of learning curve for us, but we are now at a stage where we would be ready to go live in October. Going on to the workflow process for EPA delivery, I'll just quickly walk through this flow chart to make it relevant for yourselves as our customers. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will see some swim lanes, as we call it, and those are the different teams that are involved from Pearson in the whole end-to-end endpoint assessment delivery of the services. So we have the sales team colleagues who obviously would be your account managers. We have yourselves, the customers, which would be training providers or employer providers or employers. We then have the EPA delivery team, Liz, Hannah, Michael, who you might have heard of. We then have the customer services team colleagues who are based in Manchester. And then we've got two swim lanes, which are specifically around reports and templates and documents that are involved within this service delivery process. Last but not the least, the apprenticeship services manager team members who are at the moment currently carrying out EPA planning meetings with some of you. So just to, we won't run through the whole thing, but just to set the context of where the smart EPA system kicks in and where there is an offline process. So in making the smart EPA system go live, there are some processes which happen on the system and there are some processes which happen off the system. So this representation shows you in green boxes the processes which happen within the smart EPA system, and the blue boxes indicate the processes which actually happen outside of the smart EPA system. So starting from the top, the yellow box as the start of the process, which most of you would be familiar with, is when the sales team colleagues actually create a letter of intent, which gets sent to yourselves as customers. You then sign the letter of intent and send it back to our sales colleagues. At this point, the sales colleagues then raise an EPA services contract and send that to yourselves for signing and returning to sales. We are recommending that this contract needs to be in place as a minimum 3 months prior to the estimated EPA date. We've changed this slightly based on our experience so far in the market, but I think we're trying to make this easier. But it's absolutely essential that this signed contract is in place before we progress with anything else with yourselves as customers. In parallel to when the sales colleagues actually raise the services contract, there is a process which gets triggered on Smart EPA by the EPA delivery team. And that process is essentially the details of the training provider and the employer, along with the contact name within the training provider organization to be set up on Smart EPA and linked to a specific standard. EPA services contract obviously has all of those details within the document, so that helps us to actually set yourselves up on the system in advance of us carrying out the EPA. Once that has been set up, once the contract has been signed and sent back to sales colleagues, we will have an internal system whereby we update our tracker. But once we have got your signed contract back, our customer services colleagues would check that we've got signed contract back, and they will then activate the user account on Smart EPA. On activating that account, a welcome email will be triggered from the Smart EPA system that would go to the key account user within the training provider organization. So that's the process on SmartEPA that I will talk about specifically. Getting that email trigger, there would be a prompt for the key account holder to actually schedule a training for a new user on SmartEPA. And our customer services, one of our customer services colleagues would then carry out that training with yourself. Once you've got that training and you know what you need to do on SmartEPA, there are a number of things which we will go through later on in today's webinar as well, but I'll just run through this very quickly. Once you have access to SmartEPA, you can actually download all of the endpoint assessment resources for each standard. Some of you might have access to these already, which have been happening in an offline manner, and very quickly, some of these resources include the actual apprenticeship standard, the assessment plan, the countdown to the EPA visual, which is something that we have created specific to each individual standard. We also have an EPA planning checklist, which is specific to individual standards. Our EPA specification guide, which is again specific to each standard. The gateway declaration form, a portfolio authentication and certification form, privacy notices for apprentices, and if the standard involves a online test, then a test installation guide as well. So all of these resources, the SmartEPA system now allows us to actually make that accessible to our customers online through the SmartEPA system. So it's very important that you have access to those resources as soon as you're able to. Once you are, you've downloaded the resources, obviously the idea is that you actually familiarize yourself with those resources. And when your apprentices are 2 months away from the estimated or anticipated EPA date, our expectations would be that you actually register the apprentices on the SmartEPA system. Once you have registered apprentices, the next time you need to actually do something on SmartEPA would be when you think that they're ready for taking the EPA, and we are recommending that at least 1 month before the endpoint assessment date, you attend what we call our EPA preparation webinar, which Liz Bennett, our head of EPA delivery, has been carrying out for some of you. And once you've got any sort of questions following that webinar, you can actually follow up your queries by emailing our inbox, which is epadelivery@pearson.com. Any questions would be answered by colleagues at our end. As soon as after that your apprentice is ready for the endpoint assessment, you again need to go back onto the gateway checklist, onto the SmartEPA system, and complete the gateway checklist and upload the evidence for that particular apprentice on SmartEPA. Going through the workflow process is one thing. It probably makes more sense when you actually do it yourself on the system, and we would be supporting you throughout that process as well. So in terms of the EPA delivery process, we've made some changes to the process that we have currently. We've done that primarily, because of the introduction of the SmartEPA system that we would be going live with shortly, but also from some of the experiences that we have had to make sure that the experience that you have with us as an EPA organization is absolutely 100%. So we want our contract turnaround times to be more tightly managed. This is something that's particularly being challenging at the moment, and we want to tighten up that process. We're also finding that in terms of readiness for endpoint assessment from both the providers and the employers and the apprentices themselves, there is not enough time and not sufficient time that's given in terms of the readiness. So while we have all our support services in place, unless we give it sufficient time for the apprentice, the provider, the tutor, or the employers to engage with that process, we are always chasing our tail, and we're not actually setting our learners, our apprentices, up for success. With the introduction of the SmartEPA system, obviously we've had a touchpoint process that we have followed offline so far. However, with the system, it is actually allowing us to streamline those touchpoint systems and also streamline the EPA planning meetings that our colleagues have been having with some of you. I also mentioned the online resources that you would have access to once you have access to the system. And again, that's one of the wonderful things that SmartEPA is allowing us to do. And finally, we are obviously gearing up to scale our delivery of endpoint assessment. And with that, there will be a number of different internal teams involved from Pearson. And hence, we need to make sure that our current processes actually involve these teams so that there is handover at appropriate times from one process to the other for different team members. Are you interested in having timely EPS for your apprentices? I'm assuming most of them would be yes to that. And if so, obviously there are some timelines to follow. So what are these timelines? So on the screen, you'll see a list of all the different actions that need to be completed. The blue ones that are highlighted are actions for Pearson to complete from our end, and all the rest are actions that you as a training provider or an FE college would need to complete at your end. So some of these actions in preparation for getting the endpoint assessment in time for the apprentices are firstly, the return of the signed EPA services contract. And we are saying that as a minimum, we would want this to be in place at least 3 months prior to the first EPA date. Once we have the contract in place, you will also be able to register the apprentices on SmartEPA. And again, we recommend that this should be a minimum of 2 months prior to the anticipated EPA date. Once you have registered the apprentices on SmartEPA, we would make provisional allocations of assessors, and that would be within 2 weeks from the registration date on SmartEPA. From our experience, we have seen that these dates keep moving quite a bit. So while we are calling this an anticipated EPA date, we realize that that might not be the final date that the actual EPA assessment takes place on. Once you have registered the apprentices and once you have got the signed contract in place, you would obviously have a user access to the SmartEPA system, at which point you can access the standard specific EPA resources. We recommend that you do this at least 2 months prior to the anticipated EPA date. There's quite a lot of complex documentation or systems and different types of assessment methods that you need to get your head around, that your apprentice needs to get their head around as well. And having access to those resources, making yourselves familiar to those resources would help you to actually cascade that information down to your apprentices as well. A month prior to the anticipated EPA date, we recommend that you attend our EPA preparation webinars. These would be going live from November onwards on a monthly basis. So we would have on a monthly slot for an EPA prep webinar for each of the different standards. So there's a webinar per standard, if you like. Also, within a month prior to the anticipated EPA date, we recommend that you complete the EPA planning checklist that we have. Some of you might be familiar with this already, and we appreciate that they can be quite lengthy. However, you'll be pleased to know that with the SmartEPA system, those would reduce the amount of items or fields that you need to complete. So a lot of that information that we have been collecting through spreadsheets at the moment would automatically go on to the SmartEPA system, and hence what you complete at this stage via SmartEPA would be a reduced version of the EPA planning checklist. And finally, when you have your apprentice ready to take their EPA, 3 weeks before that anticipated EPA date, we recommend that you complete the gateway checklist, which is again customized to each individual standard. And you would also need to upload evidence documentation for the apprentices, which we'll go through a bit later on as well. Once you have completed the checklist and uploaded all the evidence documents for the apprentices, we will get a notification from the system, and we will check the evidence that has been uploaded, and if everything is fine, we will confirm the assessor allocations 48 hours after the gateway checklist has been completed. Obviously, if there are some evidence documentations that are missing, we would need to get in touch with you offline or through emails to make sure that we have all the right evidence properly in place before we confirm the assessors to go out for the endpoint assessment. Currently, our service level agreement for results turnaround is 5 working days after the last EPA component has been assessed, and we have been adhering to that timeline of 100%, which is fantastic. The one thing I would mention, which is in the fine print right at the bottom on that slide, is that the anticipated EPA date needs to be at least 2 months from the date that you register the apprentices on SmartEPA. This is actually specified within the contract clause as well. And if you have signed a contract, you have agreed to adhere to those timelines. So if we do find that there are registrations on SmartEPA that are happening, giving less notice than the 2 months, we have the right to change that EPA date to make it 2 months from the date of registration. So in terms of onboarding for SmartEPA, slightly complex, bear with me. We have thought this through, so there is a method in the madness here. If you have an anticipated EPA date for apprentices in January 2019, then we will be sending out some email communications on the 15th of October to all of the key contacts that we have details for. You do need to send back the EPA signed contract if you have endpoint assessment starting from January 2019. And there is a deadline for the 15th of October for those contracts to be in place by. So that's pre-going live with SmartEPA, but we are absolutely certain that you need to have a signed contract in place before going live on SmartEPA. We will have SmartEPA training sessions by invitation only. So we would obviously have the details of all of those customers and apprentices who would need to take their EPAs from January. And our SmartEPA training sessions would be done by our customer services colleagues only by invitation. As mentioned, our customer services team would also be available for this onboarding support. Apart from familiarizing yourselves with the actions that you need to complete on SmartEPA system, there are things like test installation instructions, resource access that you would need to get familiarized yourselves with, and our customer services colleagues will be able to help you with that as well. And we will also be making a dedicated inbox available for our customers called EPA Delivery at Pearson.com. So if you do have any queries about anything related to endpoint assessments, please do email us on that inbox as well. If you have apprentices whose anticipated EPA dates are before January 2019, and we know that there are quite a few who are in our pipeline to that effect, then the first thing to be aware of is that you definitely need to have an EPA signed contract in place as soon as possible. We are very clear that if we do not have a signed contract from yourselves, we would not have any data uploaded onto SmartEPA. The contract is a basic minimum agreement of our commercial transaction, and that needs to be in place before we put in place all the service offer for each of the customers. If you do not have a signed contract in place and your EPA dates are before January 2019, we will push back those EPA dates to January 9, 2019. We are already in October almost now, and as mentioned, we need to give at least 3 months from the signing of the contract to the first EPA date. We also need to give a notice of at least 2 months for the registration of apprentices on our system. So we reserve the right to change those dates, and we will push back those dates to January if we do not have a signed contract in place. For all the customers who have got endpoint assessments that are due now up until December, our internal teams would be uploading all of the details, both for yourselves as customers and for the employers as well on SmartEPA. But we will only do this for customers who have got signed contracts with us. So a number of our colleagues are probably getting in touch with you already to gather details of employers, apprentices, and yourselves. And the reason for that is that SmartEPA requires all of that information for it to be able to schedule an EPA for your apprentices. We will be sending out customized emails to all of the key customer contacts to request specific information. One of the reasons why we are doing this is because the SmartEPA system has a method of actually uploading or downloading the information from SmartEPA for us to upload onto the ESFA portal for certification claims. And for that to happen, some of the data fields, for example, like the employer reference number, is a mandatory field, which actually allows that funding allocation to be made against the appropriate apprentice and employer. Hence our rationale for collecting some of the information from yourselves and for the employers as well. Now, if you have an anticipated EPA date for an apprentice, which is before 2019 January, and you have a contract in place, there can be two situations. First of these scenarios is that you have already had an EPA planning meeting completed by one of my colleagues, in which case we would have all of the apprentice details with us already, and we will upload all of those details onto SmartEPA between now and obviously before the date of the EPA that is due. One of our team members from the EPA delivery team will also be in touch with yourself, with the key contact, to confirm the EPA delivery dates. Obviously, each of the EPAs have a number of components, so we will give you a call to actually confirm when it's convenient for the assessor to come out to carry out those assessments. And one of the members of our customer services team will also arrange for a SmartEPA onboarding session, but this will happen only after the 31st of October. We will need that amount of time to actually get ourselves set up for go live. In the scenario that you have got a contract in place, but you have not had an EPA planning meeting yet, we will also send out a customized email to gather relevant information on the 15th of October. And you will have a fortnight to return that information to us by 31st of October. And after that, we will arrange for an onboarding and training session to be had once we have received all of that relevant information. And obviously, we will then upload all of that information ourselves at our end onto the SmartEPA system. So there are a number of actions to complete on SmartEPA for you as customers. And what I will do is I will go through 3 of these key actions, which are the primary ones that you need to be concerned with for now. And in between those, I will hand over to my colleague Hannah to actually demonstrate how these are done on the SmartEPA system as well. Before I do that, maybe I'll just stop there again to take a few questions if there are any.
When will we receive the EPA contract and from whom? Okay. And the second question, who are the key customer contacts you were referencing to earlier?
So I'll take the second one first. That's easy to answer. The key customer contacts are people who are speaking to our sales account managers about endpoint assessment. So if you're an existing Pearson customer, you should have a dedicated account manager, and you can speak to them about endpoint assessments. And we are collecting the person who at the provider end that our sales colleagues are speaking to as the key contact for the customer. The sales colleagues are also people who would be getting the contract out to yourselves. So if you haven't got a contract and you have either informed your account manager or are looking to use Pearson as your endpoint assessment organization, you need to get in touch with us. If in case you do not have an account manager or you're not a Pearson existing customer, please email the customer services team. I think it's WPL email address there. After this webinar, we will be making available an email address that you can inbox to get in touch with us to request an EPA services contract. Any other questions?
Not for now.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to looking at some of the actions that you need to complete on SmartEPA. I mentioned about having access to EPA specific resources. So once we have received the signed contract, we will obviously set up a new user account for the key customer contact. And what that does is it triggers an email from the SmartEPA system to this key user. The customer services representative would arrange an onboarding and training session with the key user. Your key contact is then able to access EPA specific resources on SmartEPA. So as I mentioned before, these would include the EPA specifications, declaration forms, privacy notices, countdown to EPA visuals, the assessment plan itself. And obviously the idea is that you familiarize yourselves with the EPA resources. You can also request additional users to be set up via the customer services team. I'll quickly hand over to Hannah now to showcase how you are able to do this on the SmartEPA system. So over to Hannah.
Good afternoon, everybody. So you should be able to see on your screen now the dashboard for SmartEPA. So this is what you will first see when you log on to SmartEPA. To access the resources Rohini's mentioned, on the left-hand side, all you would need to do is just scroll down to resources, click on view resources. So all you would need to do is just click on view resources and then select your standard.
The second action that you would need to complete as training providers would be registering the apprentices on SmartEPA. Again, as I mentioned, you need to give at least 2 months prior to the anticipated EPA date in order to register the apprentices on the system. So for that, you would need to have the details of the apprentice at hand. You can either register the apprentices one by one, or you can do a bulk upload template, and obviously we will make that template available for you to upload as well. In case your apprentices have any reasonable adjustments, then you need to indicate that against the individual apprentices as well. But Hannah can just show you some of the screens that you would need to complete in order to register your apprentices on the SmartEPA system. So over to Hannah.
Okay, so to register an apprentice, on the left-hand side, you would select Apprentice Management, Add Apprentice. You would just fill in the fields, as you can see here. Anything with a red mark against it is a mandatory field. The ULN will be checked by the system, so this is really important to make sure this is accurate. It won't let you register if it comes up as an incorrect number. The apprentices must be at least 16 years old when they begin their apprenticeship, so be careful that you're putting in the right date of birth. You can also select if there are any disabilities or anything that the assessor should be aware of. On the next tab, this is where you would select the employer that they are working for, the address where they are based, where the assessor would be visiting, obviously the training provider college that is doing the training. You would then select which standard they have been studying, customer service, for example, and then it will then show you which components are involved with that standard. Rohini mentioned we would expect the date here, the apprenticeship end date, to be 2 months in the future from the day that you are registering your apprentice. So once you have saved that, it will register the apprentice onto the system and they will be able to proceed with their EPA.
Thank you, Hannah. And then finally, as I mentioned, once you have registered the apprentice on the system and they've completed their on-program learning and they are ready to take their EPA, the next action you need to complete is to complete the gateway checklist, which is specific to an endpoint assessment, and also upload the evidence specific to that particular apprentice as well. So we would have individualized gateway checklists for each of the standards. The kind of evidence that we would typically upload would be a portfolio, for example, for an apprentice, the maths and English achievements evidence, declaration forms, authentication certification. Once you have uploaded all of the evidence, you would tick a box to confirm that you have uploaded everything. And that would then ensure that we get a notification to say that you have uploaded evidence and completed the gateway checklist. We at our end from the EPA delivery team would make sure that we check all of the evidence for the apprentice that has been uploaded, and we will confirm within 48 hours if everything is in order or whether we need additional information or evidence to be supplied for that apprentice. Once we are happy that all of the evidence has been uploaded and it's all fine, we will then confirm the assessor that would be allocated via a telephone call to, again, the key contact that has been indicated within the provider organization. Once we've got the dates confirmed for the apprentice, we will send out an email confirmation from the SmartEPA system as well. One thing I will add now is what you're seeing on the screen in terms of the different things or the actions that you need to complete on SmartEPA. All of this information would be put into detailed training manuals and training collateral that our customer services team would take you through. So each of the actions, i.e. how to access the resources, how to register an apprentice on SmartEPA, how to complete a gateway checklist. These would be modular training sessions. You would be taking that through step by step. So nothing that you need to keep in your head for now. We will support you at every stage to actually familiarize yourself with that. I think Hannah is ready to show you some of the gateway checklists. So I'll hand over to Hannah very quickly.
Okay, so to complete the checklist for your apprentice, you would just go again to the apprentice management option on the left-hand side, select view edit apprentices and select your apprentice from the list. Once you're in your apprentice's record, you will see there's some extra tabs up here now. You would just go to the checklist tab, scroll down, and you'll see there's some questions. So has the apprentice been on programme for 12 months? You would tick yes. Has the apprentice achieved their level 2 English and Maths? You would tick yes, and then it would also ask you to upload the evidence of that. Has the apprentice achieved a regulated level 5 qualification in this particular standard? Again, you would tick yes, and you would add a document to evidence this. There's no limit to the size of the document or the type of document you can actually upload. And then finally, do they have their portfolio completed? Again, you would tick yes. It wouldn't make you upload then. So if you do have to upload evidence, it will indicate that. So once you've uploaded the evidence and you have completed all the questions, you would then tick signed off by training provider, and you would save. And that would then send a notification to the EPA delivery team, who will go in and check that evidence and tick signed off by EPA, and the date was completed. After that, we would then book your EPA assessments and let you know the dates and confirm them.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. That was really helpful. I will just stop there very quickly to take any additional questions that might have been coming from the audience.
Yes, there was one question. Will there be a bulk upload feature in SmartEPA system for registrations?
Yes, absolutely. We do have a bulk upload feature. We won't show that on this stage, but that's exactly what we're using now to do the bulk uploads for the apprentices that are due in EPA between now and December. We will be able to share that bulk upload template with yourselves so that you can actually populate that, and you can either send it back to ourselves or the customer services team to do that bulk upload onto the system. Absolutely. So just quickly, I will go through the SmartEPA Go Live process. So in terms of what we are planning between now and Go Live date, which is at the moment the 15th of October. So there are just two key dates that you need to be aware of. We will obviously be following up with a lot of customized communications and emails because we have got all of your details there. So on the 15th of October, we will send out email communications to the customer key contacts that our sales colleagues have engaged with primarily. And these would be for the customers who have got their anticipated EPA dates from the 15th of January onwards. The email communications, we will also be requesting additional information from some of our customers, and these would primarily be for customers for whom we have got a signed contract in place and whose EPA dates for their apprentices fall between October and December this year. Our customer services team would also then organize SmartEPA training sessions, primarily by invitation only, and only for those customers whose EPA dates are from January 2019 onwards. The customers who do not have any contracts in place with us currently and who have got EPA dates between October and December this year, we would need to push back those EPA dates. If you do have a specific requirement to have an EPA carried out this side of Christmas and do not have an EPA contract in place, please do get in touch with your account manager very, very urgently. Do email us once we've got the email details out to you as well. Very, very important for us to know that you have a date. We should be aware of it much earlier on than now. Finally, the EPA delivery inbox, it is available for customer queries. So again, if you do have an EPA date that's scheduled, you haven't got a contract in place, please do email that. One of our colleagues would be picking it up, and we will get back to you within 48 hours. For the 15th of October, these are for the customers who've got plan dates in January 2019 onwards. We have set a deadline for the return of signed EPA contracts, which is the 15th of October. So if you've got a contract from your account manager, from our account manager, and you haven't returned it, please do make sure that you have returned that for us to get you onto SmartEPA. The second date that you need to be aware of is the 31st of October, and there's only two things that will happen on this date. One, it's a deadline for information return for all of the customers with whom we have got a signed contract in place, but we do not have an EPA planning meeting that has been carried out. Post the 31st of October, we will schedule a SmartEPA onboarding session for our current contracted customers. So these are customers who have either had an EPA carried out already without the SmartEPA system, or they are in the process of getting an EPA delivered, or they have signed a contract and have had EPA planning sessions. So there's lots of different permutations and combinations of these customers. We will not stop the delivery of the endpoint assessments, obviously, with the SmartEPA go live dates, but we will obviously organize an onboarding session so that you know for your future apprentices how to put them onto SmartEPA directly. We will be sending out proactive email communications. So if there is something that you haven't grasped through this webinar, or you have a question before the 15th of October, please do email us at epadelivery@pearson.com. We will be sharing the details of this webinar within 10 days, along with all the questions which might come through as well. So if you do have any questions after this webinar, please email us directly. And I think that's all. That brings us to the end of this using SmartEPA webinar. I'll pause very quickly there to see if there are any further questions which come in from the customers, from the audience.
There's one question that just come through. What are the resources for EPA?
Okay, the resources include what we call an EPA specification document, which is essentially a sizable document that outlines the evidence requirements, the grading and scoring matrix for each of the individual components, and what are the content areas that would be assessed for each of the individual components for that particular standard. So we have the EPA specification document. We have what we call an EPA apprentice handbook, which is essentially giving a support to the apprentice in order to prepare for the endpoint assessment. We also have certain declaration forms. So we have a gateway declaration form that needs to be signed by the apprentice, the employer, and the tutor as well, to make sure that they are happy for Pearson to be collecting the certificates on behalf of the apprentice. We have a privacy notice, which is specific to the apprentice to make sure that they are happy for their details to be collected by us as an EPA organization. We also create what we call a countdown to endpoint assessment visual, which is a visual way of making sure that you understand the process of collection that needs to happen in order to prepare for the endpoint assessment. So all of those resources, and there are a few others which are specific to a particular standard. For example, if an EPA has an online test, you would have sample assessment materials for that, which would be uploaded as a resource for that particular standard. If you have the online test within that standard, you would need to install a software as well at your end, either the provider end or the employer end. So all of those details would be part of that resource pack that is uploaded onto SmartEPA for a specific standard.
Okay, there's one more question specific to a standard. Has the specification for business administrator been finalized? If not, when will that be available?
We are in the process of finalizing that. Our colleagues are working on that currently. I think our anticipated date for finalizing that would be in December this year.
And one more question about the EPA resources. Will there be a link to access the EPA resources?
The resources can only be accessed via the SmartEPA system, so they are only available for our contracted customers. Now, I know that Ofcall have come out with a requirement for any standards that they are the EQA body for the specifications to be made available freely on the website. From October onwards, and again, we will send out communications to this effect, from October onwards, we will have a slight change in how we actually create our EPA specifications, and those would be made available for everybody to access for each of the standards.